I first want to introduce this graph just as a means of introducing people who aren't familiar to what a roast graph looks like. This is a bit of a rendering that I adapted from a Cropster screenshot. And I want to walk you through all the things that are on the screen just so that everything is more familiar for later discussion. So the green curve that looks a bit like a check mark is the bean temperature curve. And the idea here is that most roasting machines have a thermocouple, which is just a temperature probe that's stuck in the machine in a place where the beans rotate around the probe. It's not a perfect representation of bean temperature because, of course, there is air between the beans influencing it, but it's the best that we have in general. And most bean curves will have this check mark shape. Most people call it an S curve. And it's a little bit deceiving because what you're seeing is when you charge the coffee, the probe itself is hot, so it reads very high. And then as the beans are introduced into the machine, the probe cools until it matches the bean temperature and then begins to rise again. But of course, when you put beans in a machine, the coffee does not actually cool. It begins heating immediately. So there's a little bit of, call it fake news in this data for the first minute or two of a roast. The blue curve that looks a little bit like a triangle is the ROR, or rate of rise. And that curve tells you at what rate am I roasting at any moment during a batch. So that will generally start extremely high and then drop as you are roasting. Again, because of this sort of fake data issue in the beginning of a roast, the ROR is also a little bit inaccurate during the first minute because inaccurate ROR would start at an extremely high point and drop quickly. The red curve is the environmental temperature. This is generally believed to be the air temperature of the air as it leaves the machine. The bottom graph is the gas settings used during a roast. And there's an event during roasting, of course, called first crack, which is a point at which beans begin to crack open and release moisture that is held under pressure in the beans. And when the pressure within the bean grows enough that it's strong enough to break through the cell structure of the beans, it creates a fissure and a popping noise. And then eventually, the end of a roast is something we call the drop. So we call the charge the beginning and the drop the end. All right, so this is just there to have everybody be a bit familiar with the way graphs look and what all these curves mean. So I apologize, this is the only slide that has a lot of words on it. The warm-up procedure. The idea with a warm-up procedure is that the machine is a bit of a heat sink. And because of that, it's a good idea to warm up at temperatures that are higher than the temperatures at which you will start roasts. So for example, if you were starting a roast at 400 degrees Fahrenheit or 200 degrees Celsius, you might warm up at 430 or 440 Fahrenheit or maybe 215, 220 Celsius as a way of making sure that the machine is warm enough for the first batch. And the idea here is I would like the warm-up to be effective enough that the first batch of the day is going to behave exactly the same as the last batch of the day. And that's really the theme of this presentation, is strategies to make it that every batch is going to have predictability and consistency. So the details here are that you have a charge temperature. Let's say your charge temperature is 400 Fahrenheit. During the warm-up, you would turn on the gas and bring it up to something like 440, so 40 degrees above your charge temperature. You might idle there for 20 to 45 minutes, depending on the size of your machine. Smaller machines, less time; larger machines, longer time. Then for about 10 minutes before your charge, you might lower the temperature a bit and idle a little closer to your charge, but still above the charge temperature. And then you would do what I call a half BPP, which we'll talk about later. And then you would charge your coffee. And my philosophy is that every day there is an opportunity to practice the warm-up, make a few tweaks to it, and get to the point where one day, could be in a week, could be in a month, your first batch behaves exactly like later batches in the day do. Now, that's a little bit unusual in my experience. I'm gonna skip, and I'll come back in a moment. this is what I usually see in my consulting work, and this is historically what most roasters have done, which is that the first batch, that blue check mark line, goes a little slower than the second batch, the red check mark line. And the idea here, when you look at it, is, oh, okay, the machine wasn't properly warmed up before that first batch. So with the right warm-up procedure, you can get to the point where that first and second batch have identical lines that do not deviate at all when you use all of the same gas and airflow settings. So these are suggested charge temperatures. They are not written in stone. They certainly can vary by machine. And these are really just suggested starting points. They're not critical. It's just that some people say, I don't even know where to start. And this chart would be a good place to start. And let's just say that these are industry averages or norms for drum roasters. And there's nothing special about this chart, but it is a guide for someone who's a beginner. When you use larger machines in general, your charge temperature is going to be a tad higher. But more importantly, when you are doing a larger batch within a given machine, the charge temperatures should definitely be higher. So for example, if you had a 12 kilo machine and you did a 5 kilo batch versus a 10 kilo batch, you would definitely want to use a higher charge temperature for the 10 kilo batch. And the idea here is that when the beans are introduced to the machine, the beans suck a lot of heat out of the system. So if you can start with a little bit of extra heat in the system for the larger batches, you will be at a better, say, equilibrium place throughout your roast. So this graph came from a Gießen that happened to have a PID assisted warm-up. And the idea here is that you could set the environmental temperature to a constant level, which is that red line. And then once the machine reaches that red line, it'll toggle the gas higher and lower to maintain a relatively constant temperature. The bean temperature curve is the blue line. I should say the curve generated by the bean probe. There's no actual beans in the machine at this point. And as you can see, as the warm-up progresses, the bean temperature gets closer to the environmental temperature. So this is quite normal in drum roasters. And one could say that once you have found a successful warm-up, that the difference between the BT and the ET line over at about the 1 hour mark here on this graph is the normal difference for your machine. So let's say in winter, the machine started out a bit colder at the beginning of the day. You could run this program until the gap between the BT and ET is whatever it was at the end of the high idle part of your warm-up on a successful day at, say, a different ambient temperature. So again, we have this high idle that lasted, in this case, slightly longer than 45 minutes. And then we have a lower idle just above charge temperature for about 10 minutes. So this is, again, the PID assisted warm-up. This is a very similar warm-up, but it is done with manual gas settings. So what you can see here is the operator. If you look at the bottom graph, the gas graph, the operator used higher gas settings until the temperatures got up to the idling point of the warm-up, and then lowered the gas progressively, and then maintained relatively low temperatures to keep the BT and ET relatively stable for quite a long time, about 45 minutes. Okay, we saw this graph already. And okay, so that's what I want to say about the warm-up. Now, something somewhat similar to the warm-up is that between batches, you want to manage the thermal energy of the machine when the machine is empty in such a way that when you put the beans in, you are starting at the same level of thermal energy as you always do for that coffee and batch size. So when I'm talking about thermal energy, I'm talking about how much heat is stored in the machine. Your coffee roasting machine might weigh 100 kilos, it might weigh 1,000 kilos. There's a lot of metal in a lot of drum roasters especially, and that metal will hold a lot of heat or energy. And if you can use a bit of a hack, you might say, to reset that thermal energy to the same point before every roast, your roast will have a lot more predictability and consistency. So the best way to achieve this, in my experience, is to do what I think of as a bit of an oscillation. So right before you drop a batch, I recommend you turn off the gas. That way there's a consistent time at which the gas is always turned off. If you sometimes turn off the gas before dropping a batch and sometimes after, it'll be a little harder to be consistent. Then you drop the batch, close the door, and you wait about 3.5 or 4.5 minutes to reach what I call the bottoming temperature. Now, the reason I recommend 3.5 to 4.5 minutes is that I've found that there's almost no machine in which you can get to your bottoming temperature faster, but also achieve very consistent roasts all day long. In other words, if you use a successful between batch protocol, you should theoretically be able to roast 100 batches in a row without the machine creeping hotter throughout that time. Now, once you've reached your bottoming temperature, and I'll explain how to find that in a moment, then you would turn on the gas to a setting that will take you 60 to 90 seconds to reach your charge temperature. So the idea here is, let's say the first time you try this routine, you turn off the gas, you open the door, you close the door, wait about 4 minutes and check what the BT reading is in the empty machine. So let's say the BT reading is 360 Fahrenheit. And then you turn on the gas to say 10%. And then you see how long it takes you to get up to your charge temperature of, let's say, 400 degrees. With a few iterations of this, you should be able to find a bottoming temperature that you always reach between 3.5 and 4.5 minutes, no matter what you just roasted, and a gas setting that very consistently gets you up to your charge temperature in 60 to 90 seconds. This routine works universally on almost every machine. I've tried this on many hundreds of machines of all different kinds. And the idea here is I've tried to create a BBP that works universally. There's a few air roasters where this wouldn't be the best plan, and I'll address that in a moment. But in general, no matter what drum roaster you have, a version of this plan is going to work. Now, your bottoming temperature will usually be about 20 to 50 Fahrenheit or 10 to 25 Celsius below your charge temperature, but it doesn't have to be. That's just a guide if this is the first time you're ever trying this. Likewise, the gas setting you use to go from the bottom to the charge should probably be between 10 and 20% of your maximum gas, but it doesn't have to be. But if something weird is happening, if you say to me, hey, my gas setting to get up to charge in 90 seconds is 70%, then something's wrong. Perhaps the airflow is too high or there's some other problem going on. Now, this between batch protocol will work extremely well if you are roasting relatively consistent in terms of color. You're not alternating between very light and very dark roasts. And it'll work very well if you're sticking with one batch size. If you want to change batch sizes, you need something called a transitional BBP. So let's say you do all day long, you do 5 kilo batches, and then at some point you switch to 10 kilo batches. After that last 5 kilo batch and before the first 10 kilo batch, you need a special BBP that heats the machine a little bit more than usual between batches in order to reach a higher thermal energy. That transitional BBP will usually involve, if you're going to larger batches, it will usually involve about 8 minutes of idling about 10 degrees Celsius, 20 degrees Fahrenheit above your intended charge temperature. If you're switching from large batches to small batches, it'll usually involve turning the gas off for roughly 8 minutes. And then in each of those scenarios, after the idling or after the gas being off for 8 minutes, you would then implement a form of a normal BBP before charging. Sorry if that's a little confusing. I'm totally happy to answer questions about that later. So this is very common. This would be someone playing with settings and trying to find the sweet spot for a coffee and not really being sure what settings to use. And as you could see, the turning point at about 1.5 minutes is quite different in most of these. The arc of the roast curves is quite different. Some of that is due to the gas settings changing, and some of it is due to the BBP not being successful. But this is the goal. And I'm not saying it's the goal because of a certain roast curve or a certain roast goal. The idea is that you're looking at, I believe, 9 or 10 consecutive roasts here, and the bean curve, the check mark looking curve, looks like one solid line for all 9 of those roasts. There's no daylight between those lines. This sort of consistency is achievable by anyone with any machine if you implement a good BBP and if you're relatively consistent in how you use your gas and your airflow every batch. This is another example of a successful BBP. And the gray shaded area on the left of the graph is the BBP section. So several years ago, I asked Cropster to create the option to see the BBP in a graphical format, and they happily obliged, and this has been really useful for everyone. And the idea here is that during the BBP, you can see the door open and close because you see the temperature drop very quickly and then rebound sharply. And then after the temperature has rebounded, you then see a very slow decline in the temperature. Now, each of these BBP curves reaches the bottoming temperature at a slightly different time. And that's not ideal, but what's interesting about that is that the BBP is doing its job, even though the temperature arc was a little bit different in each of those curves. The BBP is evening all of that out such that by the time you charge, the roast curve behaves the same every time. So the bottoming temperature never changes. The time to reach the bottom will change a little bit batch to batch. And then if you use that same gas setting every time and it's chosen well, you'll reach your charge in 60 to 90 seconds and you should have very consistent and predictable roasting. Another example of an effective BBP over many roasts in a row. And okay, so we saw this one. Sorry, I seem to be on a loop in my computer. Okay, here we go. So there's a few exceptions. The Loring has become a very popular machine, and it's more or less an air roaster rather than a drum roaster. And the Loring allows you to set high and low temperature limits. And this is what most people use for successful BBP on the Loring, is they set the high and low limit. In this case, you're looking at a high and low limit of 400 and 500 Fahrenheit. So the big drop is the door opening. The big rebound is the door closing, and the burner kicks on. And then when the machine reaches 500 degrees, it lowers the burner and it opens this blast gate that sucks cold air into the system. And then when it reaches 400 degrees, the burner kicks on higher and it'll start to rise again. So this is what I would think of as the one cycle BBP in the Loring. One cycle meaning it hits 500, it turns off, it hits 400, it turns on, and then on the way up, you charge. And that is as opposed to the two cycle BBP where you hit 500 once, back to 400, then you come up to 500, down to 400. So you've done that twice. And then on the way up, you charge. Now the one cycle is obviously a little bit faster. The two cycle system is a little bit more effective in terms of making roasts perfectly consistent in the Loring. I purchased a machine recently called IMF, and it works a lot like the Loring, but the IMF has a PID. So what we do on that machine is we let the door open and then close, and then we wait for the inlet temperature and the bean temperature to reach a steady state and then oscillate near the set points for 2 full minutes before we're charging. So this is another example of using a BBP with, well, this is with a PID, much like that Gießen warm-up had a PID. And this is effective for this particular machine. Okay, so there are a few special cases where it's hard to create an effective BBP. Certain machines trap a lot of heat and do not have enough airflow or other situations to help cool the machine a bit between batches. One situation that causes that is having the roasting air and cooling air merge into one chimney before going out the building. Now, some brands are designed to handle a merged chimney and some aren't. And there are a lot of machines out there that shouldn't have a merged chimney but do. And in those cases, this happens where you could see during the BBP that the temperature hardly drops over the course of 7 or 8 minutes. And that's because the cooling fan is so powerful that it's overwhelming the roasting fan's ability to push air out the chimney. So it's effectively blocking the airflow to the drum, which is keeping the drum hot. Some machines have special insulation or heat exchange rods that are designed to trap and hold heat around the drum. And that can be great for keeping the roasting environment stable, but it can be very bad for helping you reset the thermal energy between batches. So that can be an impediment to a good BBP. As well, especially on some very large roasting machines, it's not possible to turn the burner off completely between batches without either shutting down the system or going through a very long, burdensome process to relight the burner. And sometimes that process is done, and it's not something you can do consistently in a certain amount of time. So, and there's a few machines with automation systems that also get in the way of successful BBP. So there are many situations that make a successful BBP difficult. I've tried talking to manufacturers about fixing those problems. So far, it's been something that is not well understood amongst manufacturers, but I think this information is slowly getting out there and helping people understand what they need to do to make their machines more consistent. And one of the last things I'll say is that roasting several batches, several different batch sizes makes consistency very difficult. So it is so much easier to be consistent if you just stick to one batch size than if you're all over the map in terms of roasting 4 kilos, 8 kilos, 10 kilos. I understand that business sometimes demands flexibility about batch sizes because order sizes can vary a lot. But anything you can do to be consistent in your batch sizes is going to make predictability and consistency so much better.